fairness. My name is Dr. Joseph Rios. I'm the head of research. Before beginning this presentation, I'd like to thank the organizing team of the series, Dr. Talvo, who's been really inspirational in helping us to organize this series and to identify great speakers like Dr. Walker here. I want to thank Rose Martinez just for her all of the great work she does in terms of the communication, getting the word out to make sure that you fantastic folks are able to attend. I'd also like to thank Jennifer Randall, our chief visionary here at CMJ, for really encouraging us to pursue the speaker series. So with that noted, we are very happy to have Dr. Micheal Walker with us today, who is a principal research scientist at HUMRO. Prior to joining HUMRO, Dr. Walker served as the director of the Center for Research on Validity, Fairness, and Equity in Learning and Assessment at the Educational Testing Service. He also had positions as vice president of validity and efficacy research at the College Board and as an assistant professor back in the day in quantitative psychology at Ohio State University. And most recently, he was the president of the National Council of Measurement and Education from 2023 to 2024. And today, Dr. Walker will be presenting on the topic of culturally and linguistic responsive assessment, talking about some of the current issues that we're facing and some potential solutions. So with that, please welcome me in joining Dr. Walker to our webinar.
Thank you. Let me share my screen real quick. Let's see. So you're seeing that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for allowing me to speak to you today. And I'd like to begin this talk with a story. So in 1960s North Carolina, an African-American woman, pregnant with her fourth child, pursued her teaching degree to fulfill a promise she had made to her father before he died, to be the first person in her family to go to college. Now, her husband supported her by working nights as a janitor so he could watch the children during the day. And thus began my foray into education because I was that fourth child. Now, my parents made countless sacrifices to provide us children the best education they could afford, all while my mother worked tirelessly to educate young people in an inner city school that I attended. Now, the teachers at that school, they show great dedication, but there's a limit to what you can do when you have hand-me-down books and poor facilities. And I often wondered, how some students could still thrive in that environment while others languished. So in the summer before sixth grade, I made a decision to devote my career to helping students who fell through the cracks of the educational system. Now, I went to college at Wake Forest University, where I studied early childhood autism and experimental psychology. And along the way, I decided, I really want to focus on methodology to help design better assessment tools. So I went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I studied quantitative psychology and statistics. And after Illinois, I taught for a while at Columbus, Ohio. But my real passion was testing. So I moved to ETS as a psychometrician, and while there, I led the redesign of several testing programs, and I conducted some psychometric research. Then I moved to College Board for a while, where I led teams of researchers conducting validity and policy research, although I was also involved in psychometric redesign work. Then I moved back to ETS to lead their new Center for Equity, researching ways to make tests more culturally responsive. And I had the opportunity to work with some really great individuals who are also dedicated to educational and assessment reform. Now, throughout my professional trajectory, I've tried to keep access and equity foremost. So now I'm at HUMRO, consulting on many different projects, but I still want to view all my solutions through that equity lens. And I tell you all this so that you can get to know a little about me personally, because for me, this talk is not really an academic exercise, it's personal. Now, here's an overview of what I will cover today. It will be a cursory overview, but I plan to leave time for discussion at the end. So first, I'm going to set the stage for assessment reform, and then I will touch on issues of fairness and validity. I'll cover 5 culturally responsive assessment principles. I'll talk about recent innovations in test. I'll wrap it up with some thoughts on personalized learning and assessment, as well as an idea on how to overcome the headwinds we're facing in the educational community as we plan to implement changes. Now, to set the stage for assessment reform, we really need to go back to the beginning. Now, George Santayana famously said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Now, I see that as a warning to all of us in this undertaking. And we have to fight against those who would hide the past with the intent of stifling change. Now, the fact is that before you can deal with inequality in assessment, you have to deal with inequity in the classroom. And before you can deal with inequity in the classroom, you have to deal with inequity in society. Now, I want to tell you about something my daughter experienced when she was 3 years old. Now, the following is excerpted from an essay she wrote when she was 14, and I quote, "All right, class, grab your markers. We're going to be drawing ourselves today." My tiny preschool hands reached for my box of markers and excitedly dumped them out on the table. "Remember, class, you can draw yourself any way you want to," my teacher announced. "Let's draw ourselves as different princesses," exclaimed my friend. I picked up my marker and started to draw myself. I drew my butterfly dress and my sparkly Skechers. I drew my curly black hair and brown eyes. But I didn't know how to color my skin. Everyone else in my class was using the peach colored marker, so I picked it up. As I was drawing, my teacher came over and asked, "Are you sure that's the right color for your skin? It looks a bit light. Maybe you should try this color," she said as she handed me a brown marker. So I started to color in my skin with the brown marker instead. But all my friends turned and stared at me. "Why are you using that marker?" they asked. "It's so dark." I tried to ignore them and finish my drawing. Once I finished, I stared at my drawing. The skin looked weird to me. It blended in with the eyes and stood out against my bright pink dress. It bled through the back of my paper, staining the table brown. I hate my skin tone. Why is it so dark? Why do I have to be different from everyone else? It's so ugly. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. For the rest of the day, I was in an awful mood. When I got in the car, I asked my dad,
But you've
"Dad,
already withdrawn, right?
Dad, why don't I have peach colored skin? I want peach colored skin. Everyone else says my skin is too dark and that peach colored skin is prettier." My father was shocked. I was already facing this kind of judgment from my peers, and at such a young age, too. He talked to my teachers and talked to my aunt as well. My aunt sent over a book called Princesses of the World, featuring princesses from all over the world, all with varying skin tones. My dad also made sure to tell me stories about people like the Queen of Sheba and the warrior Queen Zenobia, powerful Black women who I could look up to. Society has always deemed those with darker skin inferior to those with pale skin, and even my 3-year-old self was afflicted by those standards. End quote. Now, fortunately, with communal effort, we were able to help my daughter feel proud of her Afro-Asian heritage. I could see a visible change in her stature and her confidence. And when she was in first grade, I wrote her a story celebrating her name and her bloodline, which she displayed to her class with pride. Now, exclusion starts early, and we have to counteract it by fostering greater equity in the classroom. According to Gutierrez, equity has 4 dimensions: access, achievement, identity, and power. And access refers to resources that provide the student with the opportunity to learn, including quality teachers, facilities, curriculum, and supports. Achievement includes measurable outcomes such as test scores. Identity has to do with the student's opportunity to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. Power concerns who has input on the curriculum and who defines what knowledge is. Now, Gutierrez sees access and achievement as composing the dominant axis, which maintains the status quo. Identity and power define the critical axis, acknowledging the legitimacy of the student's social and cultural perspectives. Greater control lies along this critical axis and ultimately requires empowering the student with major decisions about multiple aspects of the test and the choices. Now, from where I sit, moving off center, challenging the status quo has been extremely difficult. Now, one lens that helps us to focus this inertia more acutely is found in critical race theory. Now, the CRT framework was developed as a way to interpret various government policies. And although there are different variations, 6 propositions appear to be fairly common. First, race is a social construct, not a biological phenomenon. Second, in the United States, racism is the norm, not the exception. And the third is the concept of interest convergence. People of color will experience um, legal advances only when they benefit dominant white groups. Differential racialization refers to the attribution to people of color various negative stereotypes to serve the needs of whites. Intersectionality acknowledges that everyone has multiple identities. And finally, the voice of color thesis holds that people of color know better than anyone else the effects of racism on them, and these personal narratives are themselves evidence. Now, here's an irony. So, the current surge in legislation banning the teaching of so called critical race theory in elementary school is pretty convincing support for critical race theory propositions. But what's the point? The point is a critical analysis of how racist forces in U.S. society operate will provide insights into how to combat them and to bring about social change. Now, in his book, Racism Without Racist, Eduardo Bonilla Silva also argues that racism pervades modern society, and it emerged from colonialism and slavery and has become embedded in society. It's become systemic. Now, most people in America don't believe in a superior race, and most people believe they are basically good people. And they may point to a few bad apples as the only instances of racism in America, but that isn't what drives racism. Bonilla Silva writes, and I quote, racism is about the practices and behaviors that produce a racial structure, a network of social relations at the social, political, economic, and ideological levels that shapes the life changes of various races. This structure is responsible for the production and reproduction of systemic racial advantages for some, the dominant racial group, and disadvantages for others, the subordinate races, end quote. So after the Jim Crow era, racism is much more subtle, what Bonilla Silva calls um, colorblind racism. And to me, the major point is that we are all victims, regardless of race, overrun by these three poisons of greed, anger, and foolishness. And because it's not overt, colorblind racism is much easier to deny and much harder to overcome. And that's why the work of organizations like the Center for Measurement Justice is so important. Now let's talk about fairness and validity a little bit. But first, a sip of my tasty beverage. Now, this seems to be a major area of disagreement, especially these days. And the public has different viewpoints about fairness. So if you ask them what we mean by a fair test, they may give you one of these viewpoints. Equal process focuses on making sure that everyone gets the same test under the same conditions. And this is the viewpoint of standardization. And someone else may say that standardization isn't fair to certain groups, such as people with disabilities or English learners. We need to give them certain accommodations to make sure they have the same opportunity as others to show what they know and can do. And still, others may argue that if there are any subgroup differences, then the process must not be fair. And what would you say makes an assessment fair? Inputs, content, process, outcome, something else? Maybe take a moment and just write down your thoughts. And while you do that, let's look at how the standards view fairness. Now, the standards for educational and psychological testing list fairness as a fundamental validity issue. Now, the standards list four general views of fairness. First, fair treatment during the testing process. And this view focuses mostly on standardization with all test takers having the same basic testing conditions, as well as similar prior exposure to the testing process, especially where technology is involved, while at the same time acknowledging that sometimes we need to be flexible to provide essentially equivalent opportunities for some test takers for whom certain aspects of the testing situation present an undue challenge. Now, the standards also talk about fairness as lack of measurement bias, right? So the test scores have to mean the same thing for everyone. So we look for differential prediction and other signs of differential test function. Now, the problem is that our current methods treat very heterogeneous groups as if they are all the same. For example, think about how different the people are that we classify as Asian, Chinese, Filipino, Hmong, Indian, Japanese, Korean, Laotian, Malaysian, Thai, Vietnamese. I could go on. So why would we expect all these very different cultures to approach a test in the same way? Now, accessibility contrasts the knowledge, skills, and abilities measured by a test with other knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to respond to the test. So if a person understands the tested material but cannot answer the questions for another reason, that's a problem. And we wind up wrongly concluding that the person doesn't understand the construct. And that's not fair. We have to make sure that everyone has equal access to the material. And that's why we have fairness guidelines for test developers, why we have accessibility tools for test takers like bilingual glossaries, screen magnifiers, alt text, and so on. Now, here's the question. Are we sure we've covered everything? Or are some things missing that we haven't even thought of? Now, how we interpret test scores is also a fairness issue. And this is related to measurement bias. We want to treat people as if they're all the same for convenience, but they're not. People from different social and cultural backgrounds may respond differently to test questions, even if their capabilities on the measured constructs are the same. Now, the relationship of language proficiency and context is a good example. Here's what I mean. Consider two home environments linked to lower oral English skills. The left-hand figure represents a lower SES African American family. The figure on the right represents an immigrant family in which Spanish is the primary language spoken in the home. Now, in both cases, we can expect the children from these families to have less developed so-called standard oral English skills when they start school. In both cases, this is because the children tend to be exposed to less frequent so-called standard English with smaller vocabularies and less complex syntactic structures than higher SES children from English-speaking households. And because early oral language skills predict later literacy, which is an integral part of academic achievement, we can expect children from both these environments to achieve below grade level when they start school. Now, if we believe that children from these environments have similar learning trajectories, we would look at this situation as a deficit, or we could consider that children from both these groups have different skills. For example, one study found that African American boys were accomplished storytellers who integrated poetic devices, sound effects, and movement. And another noted that the games African Americans learn as children often involve poetic improvisation and spontaneous wit. In other words, African American children may be highly advanced linguistically, just not in standard English. And for their part, bilingual children show superior performance on tasks related to executive function and attentional control. And they also tend to have more advanced metalinguistic skills than monolingual children. Now, if we were assessing these two groups of children on some subject matter other than English, but we test them in standard English, they probably won't do as well as if we found a way to give them access to the material via some more familiar medium. Now, the traditional view of assessment, as codified into standards, rests on the notion that we can measure objectively. And to do that, we must remove ourselves from the situation so we can view it dispassionately. Now, Professor Emerita Donna Haraway calls this the God trick, quote, a conquering gaze from nowhere that mythically inscribed all the marked bodies, that makes the unmarked category claim the power to see and not be seen, to represent while escaping representation. This gaze signifies the unmarked positions of man and white, end quote. In other words, objectivity, as typically used, is a code word for the absolute correctness of the white male view. Howey offers an alternative, that of situated knowledges. Each person views the world from her perspective, acknowledging that others have a different perspective. And for this reason, situated knowledges are about communities and not about isolated individuals. Now, in the same way, we can't hope to assess people successfully by viewing them from a single perspective. Now, here I draw on a paper I published last year with my colleagues, and I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators here: Margarita Oliveira Aguilar, Blair Lehman, Carla Tusis, Danielle Guzman-Orth, and Melissa Golson. Now, my colleagues and I developed 5 principles that we believe are necessary for building successful assessments. Now, assessments require a process that shares power across all concerned parties, including them at all stages of the assessment process. And this shared power includes monitoring the consequences of assessments and their uses. Assessment should be designed to foster academic engagement and belonging. Assessment should reflect the expectation that all students have the potential to perform at high levels. Assessment should be designed to maximize flexibility to account for individual differences in culture, interests, and identities for all learners. And we should consider the preferences and needs of all members of society while prioritizing those who have been historically excluded from educational opportunity. And finally, assessment should be designed to measure what students know and can do by using asset-based perspectives that disrupt the traditional deficit narratives. Now, we believe these principles should inform every step of the assessment process, from determining the target population and the purpose of the assessment, through design and administration, the score interpretation and use. And embracing these principles may help assessments to benefit a greater segment of the population. In the same way, we need to open up the entire educational space to society and society as well. Now let, now let me Let me drill down on the concept of shared power just a bit. And when we were developing these principles, this was the most fiercely contested concept among people outside of our group. The notion that non-professionals, are you hearing noise in the background?
Yes. If you can, everyone, please mute your mic.
They were just muted. Sorry, someone had background noise.
Okay, so when we were developing these principles, this was the most fiercely contested concept among people outside our group, the notion that non-professionals should have a say in test construction. But human development is a cultural phenomenon, right? So if we view students through a cultural lens other than their own, we run the risk of viewing them as deficient by our standards. And critics say that standardized tests essentially do this. The disconnect between the monocultural way of teaching and testing and other cultures' way of knowing can lead students from these other cultures to approach tests with fear and anger instead of creativity. And the result is an inequitable situation in which those students are left vulnerable and powerless. And the key to restoring students' control lies in acknowledging the legitimacy of their social and cultural perspectives. And this requires empowering the student with major decisions about multiple aspects of the test and its uses, not just design, but even the definition of knowledge becomes shared responsibilities. So how do we do this? Here's some thoughts. A glance at the right-hand column will probably convince you that this will be a heavy lift. We have to shift the test-making paradigm to include the learning trajectories of different cultures, to trust our experts, but also to trust different constituents to know what's important to them, to let students tell us what they respond best to rather than letting them only react to what we show them, and to give stakeholders a say in how test scores are used. To me, this is the test score use equivalent of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Now let's talk about possible solutions that take the concept of shared power seriously. Here's an amusing story I like to tell. And Greenfield described a situation in which researchers applied a classic measure in a different culture. Quote, Cole, Gay, Glick, and Sharp took an object sorting task to Liberia, where they presented it to their participants. There were 20 objects that divided evenly into the linguistic categories of foods, implements, food containers, and clothing. Instead of doing the taxonomic sorts expected by the researchers, participants persistently made functional pairings. For example, rather than sorting objects into groups of tools and foods, participants would put a potato and a knife together because you take a knife and cut the potato. According to Glick, participants often justified their pairings by stating that a wise man could only do such and such. In total exasperation, the researchers finally said, how would a fool do it? The result was a set of nice linguistically ordered categories, 4 of them with 5 items each. In short, the researchers' criterion for intelligent behavior was the participants' criterion for foolish. The participants' criterion for wise behavior was the researchers' criterion for stupid, end quote. Now, this was a challenge that faced the Hawaiian State Department of Education with respect to students in their Hawaiian language immersion programs. And these programs were not just teaching a standard curriculum in Hawaiian. Rather, the entire curriculum is designed around Hawaiian culture and customs. Students were taking a standard accountability exam and failing miserably. Was it because they could not access the information because of their Hawaiian immersion? Or was it that their curriculum approached the material in a fundamentally different way than the curriculum on which the accountability exam was based? Hawaiian students were learning measurement, for example, based on a traditional and personal method of measurement, but they were being tested on the metric system, which is totally foreign to their way of thinking. Now, the Hawaii DOE had a decision to make. Do they continue to test students using the standard assessment and try and teach to it? Or do they create an entirely different assessment that reflected their culture and customs? Well, they opted for the second choice. And developing the test really was a community venture. Community members were actively involved in the process because they were the holders of the communal knowledge. Parents, teachers, administrators, testing experts, they all took part. And the result was an exam in Hawaiian that reflected the knowledge, skills, and understandings that the students needed to become successful members of their society, including the skills that would prepare them for college. Now, the Ka'eo is one solution to the issue of different socio-cultural contexts, and I can think of many others, and I'm sure there are many I'm ignoring as well. So the first solution is a single assessment. This is what the Hawaii Department of Education had at the beginning. Single assessment measuring content and standards dictated by the mainstream. And I believe this is the approach that the universal design for assessment principles, which are covered in the standards, were meant to address. We represent multiple subgroups in the test items. Maybe we include names and even situations that are multicultural, but I think there's a limit to how much we can tweak the test in one direction without having an equally undesirable impact on another group. And the general problem with this approach is, as author Jason Reynolds said, whenever something has been standardized, that means that we have made someone invisible. Now, a second solution, parallel assessments, may involve the same assessment in more than one language or format, or it could be two different tests. Now, the second case is where Hawaii DOE ended up. They were measuring the same fundamental standards, but they were doing so in different ways in two very different populations. And so far, it appears to be working for them. Now, a logical question is, how do you know? How do you know that two assessments are really measuring the same standards when they're so very different from each other? How do you know that two students classified in the same way, each by a different assessment, are really in the same place in terms of what they know and can do? Now, these are difficult, but not impossible questions to answer, and a lot of it depends on how you plan to use the information. Now, I won't go into detail about comparability issues in this talk, but I hope we can discuss them afterward. Now, a variation on that theme is assessments placed in the context of specific subgroups. For example, the question on the left is the original, and the one on the right has been adapted for Aboriginal test takers. Same question, different context. Now, a third option is, instead of changing the test, to adapt the scoring rubrics to different subgroups. The Army, for example, now has the same fitness test for men and women, but the qualifying scores may be different across sex. Another example of contextualized scoring involves adapting essay rubrics to allow features of African American vernacular English as well as standard American English. Now, here's some AAV features that are typically penalized in essays. For example, that second line, the use of the invariant be to indicate a habitual aspect, as in she be walking, or the past participle been to indicate initiation in the remote past. For example, she been going to church. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about universal design for learning. Now, the organization CAST has developed a set of guidelines based on the UDL framework. And according to CAST, these guidelines offer a set of concrete suggestions that can be applied to any discipline or domain to ensure that all learners can access and participate in meaningful, challenging learning opportunities. Now, what I like about UDL guidelines is their simplicity. You only have to remember three things. I can do that. The goal of UDL is to provide multiple means of engagement, that's the why of learning, multiple means of representation, the what of learning, and multiple means of action and expression, the how of learning. And the guidelines themselves fit into a grid with these three modes as column headers, and the rows correspond to guidelines designed to access, build, and internalize on the way to the ultimate goal of expert learners who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal-oriented. Now, the UDL framework can easily be viewed through an anti-racist lens as well. And the latest update was just released in July, and it emphasizes addressing barriers rooted in biases and systems of inclusion. Whoops, I'm going backwards. Where am I? There we go. Now, a fourth option is more aligned with UDL. Let me go back for a minute. Yeah, I got it. The fourth option is more aligned with UDL, and this is firm goals, flexible means. We can envision a test like AP US History, for example, which is where this question came from, where the student can choose which question to answer. And just as with parallel assessments, we have to figure out a way to make sure the two tests give equivalent scores. Now, another issue is that students don't always make good choices. Too often, a student will choose to answer a question on which the student will perform worst rather than best. But there's another problem. According to UDL, this type of choice doesn't go far enough. All these options involve the same means. In other words, they offer no choice at all. Now compare this to AP 3D Art and Design, where the student can choose any medium of expression: acrylic, ceramic, plastic pipe, Q-tips, leaves, twigs, stoneware, or more. And the student can produce anything from those materials. Now that's real choice. Now the last option is no assessment. And this may seem like a throwaway, but I don't think so. It may be a valid choice here, especially in the context of the classroom. Why not make assessment an integral part of learning itself? And this may be closely aligned with the concept of assessment as learning that was central to CBAL. Now, for those who are not familiar, ETS's CBAL research program, cognitively based assessment of, for, and as learning, used these ideas to design learning progressions and assessment prototypes that became the basis for the ETS testlets, which are now being marketed to school districts. And although the testlets were not specifically designed to address the needs of traditionally underserved learners, their basis in learning progressions and the ideas of use of assessment for and as learning might help teachers of such students better plan and adjust instruction for them. And along with the assessment as learning, why not learning as assessment? I mean, if a student has successfully completed the lesson, isn't that in some sense evidence of mastery? Now, logically, it makes sense, but this also has problems. And let me pause for another tasty sip of my beverage. Here's the question: how do I think we can close the opportunity gap? Now, the historical educational policy towards students of color in the United States has been one of assimilation, and we haven't broken free of that yet. So we need to continue to develop a more multicultural curriculum. And as the US population continues to diversify, the urgency of diversifying the curriculum will also increase. Now, teachers need to more opportunities for professional development and accessible learning strategies, anti-racism, developmental disabilities, the most up-to-date pedagogy, and emerging teaching techniques. Now, ultimately, I think I'm arguing for more personalized learning, and this requires effective technology in the classroom, an increased presence of teacher aides, administrators, and policies that support these changes, and budgets that allow them actually to happen. And we need assessments that reflect and even facilitate the move toward personalized learning. And this includes interim assessment tools. But we also have to figure out how to incorporate context into the building and scoring of summative assessments. And I say that with the knowledge that the field's current fairness guidelines in many ways push against this greater context, which leaves us puzzled and students penalized. And what I'm talking about here is teachers using contextualized assessments to help the teachers personalize their approaches to the learning needs of each student. And this is very different from using standardized assessments to shuttle students into tracks where they may be stuck for the duration. Now, I guess you could argue that tracking is also a different kind of personalized learning, but it's not the kind that I would espouse. Now, as many of you, I'm thinking many of you may be stuck on that first bullet. And you may realize that several state legislatures are assaulting even the basic teaching of history and foregoing, for example, the 1619 Project in favor of a curriculum that teaches the overwhelming benefits my ancestors gained from slavery. But this isn't new. I mean, this is a new phenomenon. It's a major thread of the fabric of racism in America. Here's a quick history lesson. So many people don't realize that my home state of North Carolina has the dubious distinction of being the site of the only successful insurrection in U.S. history. After the Civil War, Wilmington, the largest city in the state, set up an integrated government that was very successful. But in 1898, white supremacists formed a coalition to try to win the state elections through fear and intimidation. And unable to take over the local government legally, they burned local Black businesses, they stormed the courthouse and forced the mayor to resign. Now, the state militia, which was sent to quell the insurrection, instead helped drive prominent Blacks and white sympathizers out of town. And this armed political coup was the beginning of decades of Jim Crow legislation in Eastern North Carolina. But in North Carolina history books, the leaders of that massacre were revered as heroes who prevented a riot by rebellious Blacks in the city. And any books to the contrary were quickly banned from school. Does this sound familiar? Now, how do we compete against that? Well, sociologist Lynn Latukas, author of the 2014 book Primetime Pundits and co-editor of the 2016 book Measuring Success, noted that all the logic and data in the world can't by itself change public opinion. And she pointed out that an appeal to emotion can be much more effective. She offers the following guidelines for building a successful movement. First, construct a popular frame. Don't be afraid to piggyback off other popular movements. Expanding the domain to include as many people as possible also helps. Use a common condition to which many people can relate. Personalize the problem. Use your vision and your voice to draw people in. Help them relate it to their personal experience. Simplicity is good. Don't be afraid to use villains when appropriate. Us against them is incredibly effective. And why do I mention all this? Because the anti-equity sentiment in this country is rapidly increasing. And to turn that around, we have to be great salespeople. We have to convince the people in power, not intellectually, but at a gut level, that is in their best interest to be more inclusive. Now, I'll leave you with this quote from Daisaku Ikeda. A great human revolution and just a single individual will help achieve a change in the destiny of a nation and further can even enable a change in the destiny of all humankind. So it starts in me, it starts in you. When you change your own character, when you develop yourself, when you go through that human revolution, then you can start to make a change in an environment. And it just takes one determined individual. You have a strong proof of that in the founder of the center, Dr. Randall, from who I personally draw great inspiration. And I thank you for your kind attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Walker. That was a fantastic presentation. So now we have about 24 minutes for questions. We're going to open it up to the group here. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or otherwise unmute your mic and ask Dr. Walker directly. So, Dr. Walker, I'll kick it off. You talked about the importance of essentially building in the test taker, the student's voice into the assessment process.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of the traditional assessment development process of, say, construct articulation to score reporting? Where exactly do you see the involvement of students and to what degree?
I think students should be involved from the very beginning. I mean, there's some techniques that are used in different contexts that could be useful here. So um, the question formulation technique, for example, is used in classrooms and some classrooms currently. And the way it works is that before a teacher embarks on a lesson, the teacher will ask the students, okay, so we're going to learn about sea mammals or whatever. What kinds of questions would you like to um, learn the answers to during this lesson? And the students write down their questions, they vet them among each other, and they come up with a set of questions. And those questions become the basis for the lesson itself. And I think that we could use the same kind of technique when we um, design tests. Why not ask students, okay, what kinds of questions do you think are most important to your, the answers to which are most important to your understanding of whatever concept is being measured on the assessment? Why not? And also, I think it's important to just do focus groups with students, ask them, okay, so if we want to know about algebra, how do you think that you best demonstrate your knowledge of algebra? And I bet it's not going to be multiple choice questions, right? So, I mean, there are all sorts of different techniques, and we have to be open to those techniques, and we have to um, expand our minds and our technology to allow those techniques to be demonstrated on our assessments. So, and not just students, parents too. Like you might go, well, what does the student know about what the student should know? You'd be surprised. Um, but parents definitely know what their kids need to know, and why not ask them? And so you'll find some assessments, some state assessments that claim to do this. But what happens is the test developers develop the uh, items, and then they send them to external committees, including parents, to review. And I think that's backwards. Don't show me what you think, because I'm going to respond to what you showed me. Don't show me what you think I should know or what you think I should respond to. Ask me what I want to respond to and use that as the basis for the assessment.
Thank you. We have another question here from Sergio who says, great presentation. Speaking about the standards, what is your wish list for the new edition for changes that could bring the view you shared today for testing assessment?
Um, uh, we need to revamp that fairness section above all. Yeah, and Sergio actually, when he was uh, the head of the Grad Student Issues Committee in NCME, um, had some great presentations. He got speakers, including me, to come and speak about the standards, and wrote a document that went to NCME on things that the grad students thought would be great additions to the standards. But I think the fairness really is the heart of it all, the fairness chapter. And once the fairness chapter is expanded, I think they're going to have to expand the validity chapter as well, because our current notions of validity, and Sergio, I know you know this from your dissertation, which is what gave me a little bit of inspiration of my own. Um, we can't uh, just look at our typical ways of validating things. Like, let's say I, as a test taker, do not believe that this test score represents my capabilities. Is it valid? I don't think so, right? So we have to incorporate the students, the test takers' um, viewpoints into each validity argument as well. And you might go, yeah, well, you're going to think it's valid as long as you did well, and you're not going to think it's valid if you didn't do well. But let me tell you a story. So, one professor actually decided to give online tests to all his students, and he said that there was one student that said, "I just don't do computers," and so hearing her say that, he said, well, tell you what, let me give you a paper and pencil test, which he did. And she did about the same on that one as she did on the computerized test. And she said, okay, I guess it does reflect me. But that's the kind of process we need to go through with validation as well. You can't just throw something at me and say, this is a valid measure of you. You have to ask me, do you think this is a valid measure of you? Do your parents think this is a valid measure of you? And this is how we have to include people in the validation process. Like, we really have to expand who is part of that validity argument.
Thank you. I would like to build on that idea. So around collecting validity evidence, I think one of the major challenges we have is in collecting validity evidence for small minoritized groups. And oftentimes we just say, you know what, there isn't the end here for us to do our typical quantitative analyses. Dr. Walker, what would be your recommendations for us pushing the field to think more critically about gathering validity evidence to support the inferences that we're making from assessments for small minoritized groups?
Um, yeah, I guess Joseph, you were at ETS and back in the day, right? And I guess when you were there and I was there, I would never have said this, but my own thinking has expanded. There's something to be said for qualitative evidence too, and anecdotal evidence, just like in the critical race theory tenets. Anecdotal evidence is very powerful. Let me give you an example. Um, If you go on YouTube, you can find the 2019 AERA presidential address and by Dr. Wells. And I'm not really interested in her talk because she said a lot of stuff I totally disagree with. But before her talk, there was a presentation by a group of young women, young African American Latino women who talked about assessment and and a dramatization. And it was the first time I saw it, I thought, these poor ignorant youth. They just don't understand testing at all. But then later I watched it again. And I'm like, they got a point. They really have a point. This test does not represent them. And when we say that it does, we do them a big injustice. So, and this is all anecdotal, right? It's just them telling us about their feelings, but we need to pay attention to that. And we need to incorporate it into our validity arguments.
Thank you for that. We have another question here from Rochelle who says, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Walker. Can you talk a little bit more about comparability in the context of culture responsive assessments? You alluded to this issue in your presentation.
Yeah. So, uh, currently a colleague of mine and I, uh, Harrison Kell, we're working on studying these issues. We just started writing up a proposal to do some research on these issues. But I'm reminded of a commission back in the late 90s that was headed by Michael Foyer. And the goal of the commission was to figure out how to link all sorts of state assessments to NAEP, to the NAEP scale. So can we put everything on the same scale so that we can not necessarily use them interchangeably, but so we can make translations from one to the other? And their conclusion was, no, you can't, because the document, if you're looking for it, is called Uncommon Measures. It's free, it's online, you can get it in PDF. It's not high quality, but the material is high quality. So, and but Michael Foyer told me that at the end of their deliberations and writing, almost the very end, another researcher, educational researcher, Rosaboom, told them this, it's not so much trying to figure out how to make all these different measures comparable. The real goal is to figure out what you can say within the realms of their incomparability. So he didn't say it exactly like that, but my words. But basically this, they're different. How different are they? And how much can you say about these two different groups that took each test, given the incomparable nature of these measures? And as long as you keep your statements, your conclusions within the bounds of the imprecision of the measures, you're doing fine. So that's the starting point for my argument. And then there are other parts too. You got to find, for example, you can always find an external criterion if you like are into criterion related validity that you really believe is unbiased. Good luck with that. But if you can find one, especially performance measures. So performance measures are harder to mess up, Like if you ask somebody, can you do this job? And they do the job, you might have one measure that um, that hones in on one particular aspect of needed for the task, and another measure that hones in on a different aspect. And different people might use those two aspects to advantage to get the job done. I mean, there's always more than one way to do a job, right? So in the same way, there should be more than one way to measure preparedness to do a job. Each one uh, more appropriate for people who use that methodology to get the job done. That's a roundabout answer to your question, Rochelle, but yeah.
We have another one here from Priya. It says, thank you so much for this great presentation. As we try to be intentionally inclusive in our assessment development process, how could we respond to pushback from people who say, but math is math and science is science?
Well, it just so happens that the Hawaii test I was talking about was a science test. So that's a good example of how science is not necessarily science. And in the same way, I think math is not necessarily math. If you're looking at how uh, people in Hawaii, like how they measure things, it's very different. I mean, if you look around the world too, like I just one day, I don't know how like YouTube sends me feeds, but they sent me these feeds on doing multiplication of large numbers, and they had like three or four or five different cultures they pushed to me, like and one from India, one from Korea, one from Japan, one from the United States, and the way these different students were performing these large number multiplications was very different and very effective. And so math ain't math either, I guess is the point. I mean, the way you approach the subject can be very different. And therefore, the way you test the subject probably also needs to be very different. I'm reminded of the Algebra Project, which is an attempt to teach algebra to um, underrepresented and minoritized students. And the way they did so, I mean, the way they're doing this is very novel. And it's amazing to me because they're teaching these young kids, they're like junior high school students, graph theory. I mean, this is what I did my dissertation on, and they're doing graph theory and they're working out solutions to these very complex systems that most people wouldn't have a clue about. And these are people that haven't really even been exposed to math before the Algebra Project. So yeah, math ain't math. Well, science isn't science. I mean, everything is contextualized to me.
Thank you. So I have a question for you. Much of the discussion around culture responsive, culture inclusive assessment has focused, many of the examples have focused on very specific contexts, such as the Hawaii context as an example, or an indigenous context. Can you speak to this type of work in very heterogeneous populations? For example, let's say the New York City public schools. What will this look like?
Yeah, and that's something I've been grappling with, and I've had conversations with my colleagues about the correct approach. And so, um, let's talk about computer adaptive tests. So one thought is that you give people a few questions and see what kinds of questions they seem to do best with, and then slowly hone the rest of the assessment in that direction, with every now and then a few questions thrown in just to see if you're on the right track, or if there might be another direction that might be more um, appropriate. But then you need these huge data banks, and it's going to be a long test while you try and figure out what kind of assessment is best for a given student. Another option that we talked about was, why don't you just show people different ways of being assessed and let them decide? Again, with the caveat that students don't always make the right choice, but I think they may know better than we do sometimes what's good for them. And yeah, so that's one of those issues I haven't figured out. We've just been talking about how would you actually do this in practice? And one method that has also been talked about is maybe you use characteristics of the individual to decide beforehand which assessment to give them. And that's definitely more efficient, but it also has a built-in danger, which is you're stereotyping people. And like, just because I'm African American doesn't mean I'm like every other African American, because I like to think that, for example, I'm very different than, I don't know, Clarence Thomas. And I don't think he and I would communicate in the same way. I don't think we take the same assessment in the same way. So, um, work in progress, I don't know. We just have to continue to uh, keep thinking of ideas until we figure it out. That's a non-answer. That was a long non-answer. Nisha, I saw your hand up before too.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the presentation and then just your insights on all these questions. I heard a lot about costs, like there's a cost. Could you just elaborate more, like what are some specific costs that are associated with culturally and linguistically responsive assessments?
The biggest cost right now is our political climate. Everything is politicized. And if you go back to, if you remember the slide on um, critical race theory, one of the big things is we're only going to affect a change like that benefits people of color if it also benefits uh, white folks, if it also benefits the mainstream. And I don't see any benefit to the mainstream for opening up testing to people who are not in the mainstream. And and remember, I said that I don't think like Bonilla Silva. I really believe his this book changed my life, by the way. If you can go out and buy it, buy it. Or if you can borrow from somebody, read this book because it's so good. Racism Without Racists. And here's why: because I used to have this notion that um, like all white people were just deliberately racist. I don't believe that anymore. I really don't. I mean, it really is. This system has a life of its own, and we're all sucked into it, and it becomes an in-group, out-group thing. So, and if you just think about social psychology, like people in your in-group, if somebody, if you fail, for example, if you're in the in-group and you fail, you make an external attribution. If somebody in the out-group fails, you make an internal attribution. Well, course they're going to fail because they're like that, you know. And if um and if somebody in your group does something stupid, oh, that's a bad egg, right? If somebody outside your group does something, that's the way they are. All these things force us to think, and it's just human nature to think about our group and our way of doing things as the right way of doing things. And given that most legislatures in most states are predominantly white and mainstream in their point of view, good luck trying to get people to actually adopt culturally responsive, linguistically responsive assessments. It's really an uphill battle. So that's the headwind that we face. But if you trust Lynn Latukas, then you'll figure out a way to convince people in those legislatures, in those departments of ed, that it really is in their best interest. And like I said, appealing to logic ain't going to work. But if you appeal to emotions, which is how they get most of the legislation passed, then you might have a chance. There's more of a cost too. I mean, there's a physical cost. Like if you try and develop all these assessments, it does cost money. And if you're in local districts, then local districts are supported by property tax. So you got to pay more for all of this. And people are reluctant to cough up money for somebody not like them.
Beyond the political issues that may arise, as well as the financial resources required to do this kind of assessment, can you also speak to, concerns around our typical way of seeing standardized assessments, the standardization process, wanting to, develop assessments that are culturally neutral? And one thing that we tend to hear about is, if we're going to add in this additional contextual information, it's going to make items longer. There's more cognitive fatigue on students. Can you speak to some of those issues and maybe ways that we can overcome those barriers?
Trying to think where to attack them from. So it really depends on what side of the fence you're sitting on, right? And you know this because I don't know, Jennifer Randall has written a lot on this issue with her colleagues. Um, we have a certain way of testing in this country in place that benefits the mainstream because that's really who it's designed for. And so like Donna Haraway said, like this notion of impartiality, of objectivity, really is the notion of the mainstream way of doing things. And so there's really no incentive for the mainstream to do anything different, not for their own personal benefit. So, but some people, like and more people, I hope, are realizing that our success as a nation as a whole really depends on the success of every individual, not just a group of individuals, you know. So uh, uh, they're coming around to the notion that it'll benefit the whole country if we start to pay attention to people who have traditionally been marginalized. Again, that's a non-answer to your question, but I just I'm not feeling hopeless. I'm just feeling like we got to buckle down because it's going to take a while. I forgot your question, man. I don't even know if I answered it. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, so ask me again.
Um, well, I think you addressed some of the issues here for me in terms of us needing to think about a new way of assessment. The traditional way that we've been thinking about assessment needs to be revamped, and I think that culture responsive assessment is really a solution to that, of really us developing assessments not for individuals but with them and for them. So I think that's a really, really important point. So with that noted, I mean, unfortunately, we've run out of time here. This hour has flown by. I'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Walker, for your time and for this excellent presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for attending here on this Friday. We have recorded this. Dr. Walker has been friendly enough and nice enough to allow us to post this on our YouTube channel. So please check that out, and we will be sharing that soon. And if you can, share that with other folks. We want to continue this conversation and continue to build this community as we do this important work. With that note, I'd like to thank you all for being here again, and I wish you all happy holidays for you and your family. Thank you so much.